everyone, so welcome back to our second lecture about how do they keep us alive. So part 2, talking about the respiratory, the circulatory system, and the coronary blood vessels and how they keep us functioning. Now, let's talk about the respiratory system first. So here is an overview that I have developed. And before we get started with the details, let's look at the pathway of the respiratory system. So we breathe air through our trachea, which then goes to the bronchi, the hilum, which is a place where the bronchus enters the lung, kind of like a doorway. Then the bronchi are divided into further lobar bronchi, which then supply the lobes with air, the segmental bronchi, and then the bronchioles, which lack cartilage. Next, we move to the alveolar ducts, the alveolar sacs, and the alveoli for gas exchange. And that's the site where a gas exchange occurs. And so now let's examine the functions. So one of the main and obvious functions is to allow us to breathe, to get that fresh oxygen into our system and remove carbon dioxide waste. So now let's talk about the thoracic cavity. So the thoracic cavity contains 2 pulmonary cavities, and the pulmonary cavities contain 2 pleural cavities. So cavities are kind of like pockets that surround the lungs. So the pleura are kind of like pockets that surround the lungs. And the mediastinum is also a cavity for the heart. So let's talk about pleural cavities. So we have 4 types of pleura. We have visceral pleura and parietal pleura. So visceral is found on the surface of the lungs. So I like to remember visceral as surface with the S in visceral. Then we have parietal pleura. So the parietal pleura are found on the wall of the thoracic cavity, so the diaphragm, the rib cage, and the mediastinum. And then we have the 4 pleuras. So we have the costal, the cervical, the diaphragmatic, and the mediastinal. So costal means inside of the rib cage. Cervical is located by the neck. Diaphragmatic, located in the bottom of the diaphragm. Mediastinal faces the mediastinum. So again, a hint or an mnemonic that I like to remember is Carly's cows drink milk. Now, whenever our lungs fill with air, our pleural cavity also expands. We have something called pleural fluid, which prevents the 2 layers of our pleura from sticking to each other. Kind of like oil and dough, right? You oil up your hands usually when you're kneading dough because you don't want your hands to stick. So the pleural fluid kind of does the same thing. It prevents that sticking of the pleura. The pleural fluid also keeps our lungs from collapsing by exerting the surface tension, which keeps the lung drawn toward the thoracic wall. So, as you can see here, this is a picture of an X-ray with a lung that's collapsed. And an important feature of that is also residual air, which is air left over from expiration. So this air is very important to keep our lungs partially inflated after expiration to prevent our lung from collapsing. And this is because a common way of lungs collapse is due to the puncturing of the parietal pleura. And so as a result, the atmospheric air enters that, gets rid of the residual air, and that's how your lung collapses. So now let's compare and contrast the lungs. So we have a left and a right lung. And here I can see that the right lung contains 3 lobes. So it contains the superior, the middle, and the inferior lobes. It contains 2 fissures, so the horizontal fissure as well as the oblique fissure, which is found in the middle because the left lung also contains the oblique fissure. And the right lung is larger and wider, and it's shorter compared to the left lung. The left lung has 2 lobes, so it has the superior inferior lobe, 1 fissure, which is the oblique fissure. It has a cardiac notch and the lingula as well. So the lingula is found on the superior lobe of the lung, and it's kind of like a tongue-like shape. And so during inspiration, the lingula moves in and out of the costal mediastinal recess. So let's get to that part. So our lungs have two recesses. So costomediastinal recess is located between the ribs and the mediastinum, as you can see in this diagram. And then the diaphragmatic, costodiaphragmatic recess is located between the ribs and diaphragm. So one way I kind of like to remember this is MD. So MD kind of falls into those two words. Now let's look at the mediastinal surface of the lungs. So this includes the pulmonary ligament, and this is where the visceral and parietal pleura come together. So think about palm kind of sounding like palm, so a handshake. So when you like handshake, you meet someone, right? When you're handshaking. So same thing with the visceral and parietal pleura coming together and meeting. For the hilum, it's kind of analogous to a doorway, which I mentioned. And this is where exactly the structures of the lung enter and leave. And these structures include the pulmonary veins, the pulmonary arteries, and the bronchus. So again, an anomic that I like to remember is volcanoes are bad, which refer to veins, arteries, and then the bronchus. The root of the lung consists of structures that connect the lung with the heart and the trachea. So it's an actual area where you can see the structures leaving and entering the lungs. And then we have the pleural sleeve. So the pleural sleeve is where the parietal and visceral layers of the pleura surround the root. So think about the pleural sleeve to protect the root. Same thing with axons, right? When we look at an axon, we see most of the time it's covered by a myelin sheath, which protects the axon. Same thing with the pleural sleeve to protect the lung or the root. So let's continue with our lungs. So the lobes then further divide into bronchopulmonary segments, which are supplied by the pulmonary arterioles. The bronchial veins drain the blood supplied by the bronchial arteries near the roots of the lung. So as you can see here we have the right and the left lung lobes, and the right lung lobe consists of the middle lobe, so that includes the lateral and bronchopulmonary segments. Then the medial bronchopulmonary segment as well. Both the right and left lung lobes include the superior, the inferior, and the superior inferior. So the superior lobe consists of the apical, anterior, and posterior bronchopulmonary segments. The inferior lobe consists of the superior, anterior basal, medial basal, lateral basal, and posterior basal bronchopulmonary segments. Note that for the left lung, there is no middle lobe, so therefore there is no lateral and medial bronchopulmonary segments as well. Note that when contrasting between the parietal pleura and the right bronchial vein, the parietal pleura's venous drainage includes the accessory hemozygous and the hemozygous vein. Now let's talk about plexuses. So there's two, the deep and the superficial lymphatic plexus. So the superficial lymphatic plexus is deep to the visceral pleura, and here is a flowchart that I created to kind of summarize the pathway. So we start at the bronchopulmonary or hilar lymph nodes, which then drain into the inferior and superior bronchial lymph nodes, and then the bronchomediastinal trunks, and then to the lymphatic ducts. So here is an anomic, big, heavy bison bite lemons to help you remember the pathway. Now, let's talk about the PNS and SNS, so parasympathetic nervous system and sympathetic nervous system effects. So, for the parasympathetic chain supply, we have the vagus nerve. So the vagus nerve, V kind of starts with very, so very hard working. For parasympathetic supply, which stimulates the ganglion cells in the pulmonary plexus and the bronchial tree to result in bronchoconstriction. And this causes mucus to secrete, which is important for the cough reflex. For the sympathetic chain supply, we have both the vagus nerve and the sympathetic trunk innervating the pulmonary plexus, which can result in the bronchodilation of the lungs to increase oxygen supply. So now you might be asking, well, why do we need to bronchodilate? Why do our lungs dilate when everything else is mostly inhibited? Well, that's because it supplies blood to the skeletal muscles, right? So having that increased oxygen supply means that oxygenated blood can pump to the muscles very quickly. So one way to think about this is a bear analogy, which I used last time as well, where if you do meet a bear in the wild and you make eye contact, you want to run. And so you start breathing heavy and your heart starts beating faster, is because you want that blood supply to reach the skeletal muscles to help you run away. Now, let's move on to the heart, so the circulatory system overview. So here I've created a flow chart that depicts the entire flow of deoxygenated to oxygenated blood. So again, the functions is that it delivers oxygenated blood to cells and then removes waste. Okay, so starting off with the superior and inferior vena cava. This is where deoxygenated blood enters and then goes to the right atrium. Then we have the tricuspid valve, and then it goes to the right ventricle, the pulmonary arteries, and then the lungs, where it becomes oxygenated. And then here I depicted oxygenated as pinky. And so pulmonary, it goes to the pulmonary veins, then the left atrium, the mitral valve, the left ventricle, and the aorta, and then finally the rest of the body as well. So now let's talk about the heart. So the heart has 4 chambers. It has 4 surfaces. These include the anterior diaphragmatic, inferior left pulmonary surface, and the right pulmonary surface. And then 4 borders and 3 walls. So let's go back to that surfaces. So the anterior surface faces the sternum and the ribs, and it's mainly made by the right ventricle. The diaphragmatic surface is made by the left ventricle. So the diaphragmatic surface, I know Dr. Ritu mentioned a beer belly, but what I like to kind of remember is a pregnant woman laying on their side, so left side. Then we have something called the left pulmonary surface, which is mainly made by the left ventricle, and then the right pulmonary surface, which is mainly made by the right ventricle. The 4 borders include the right border, which is mainly of the right atrium, inferior border, which mainly encompasses the right ventricle. Left border is mainly the left ventricle and left auricle, which sits on top of the left atrium. And then we have the superior border, which consists of both the right and left atria, the corresponding auricles, the pulmonary trunk, superior vena cava, as well as ascending aorta. And I don't know if I mentioned, but I did come up with these mnemonics to help you remember the 4 surfaces. So armadillos dig left, right, and then borders, so rainwater in left shoe. And then the walls, we have the epi, the myo, and the endocardiums. So elephants make echoes. Something really important is also the pericardium. And the pericardium is a sac, kind of like a sac that surrounds the heart, like a glove, which prevents the overexpansion of the heart. So if the heart were to overfill up with the blood, the pericardium prevents it from bursting. Okay? And it's a double-folded membrane. So the outer membrane is a fibrous pericardium, which you can see in this picture right over here. The inner membrane is serous pericardium. So a way that I like to remember these 2 names is that outer kind of means fiber. Like I like to think of carrots. Carrots are very fibrous, especially their peels. So that's what I think about fibrous pericardium outside. Or another good way to remember the inner membrane is serous pericardium, where serous kind of sounds like serrated teeth, which are found inside the shark. So inside inner membrane, right? We also have the serous pericardium broken down into 2 others. So we have the visceral serous pericardium as well as the parietal serous pericardium as well. The visceral serous pericardium is right next to the epicardium of the heart, which comprises part of the epicardium. Now let's compare and contrast once again, this time for the sides of the heart. Left side receives oxygenated blood from the lungs. Oxygenated blood comes from the pulmonary veins. Blood passes through the left atrium, the mitral, and then to the left ventricle and then aorta. Note that common on both sides is that each side contains a ventricle and an atrium, right? And then on the right side of the heart, it receives the deoxygenated blood. The deoxygenated blood comes from the inferior and superior vena cava, blood passes through the right atrium, the tricuspid, and then to the right ventricle, and then lungs. Now let's look at the right atrium a little bit closely. But before that, I want to outline some key messages. So the right side of the heart receives the deoxygenated blood, superior vena cava connects with the right atrium, the pulmonary trunk connects with the right ventricle. For the left side of the heart, that includes the left side handling oxygenated blood, pulmonary veins connect with the left atrium, and the aorta connects with the left ventricle. So right atrium receives deoxygenated blood, like I mentioned, and it also consists of pectinate muscles. Okay, and the oval fossa is also located between the superior and inferior vena cava, and the opening of the coronary sinus is also found here. For the left atrium, it forms the base of the heart. So the right and left pulmonary veins enter the heart. The left auricle is on top of the left atrium. And a key message is that the pectinate muscles are found in both the right and left atriums and the right and left auricles as well. The wall of the left atrium is also more smoother and thicker, so important contrast, than the right atrium. And the LA, so left atrium, has the valve of the foramen ovale. The right ventricle consists of the conus arteriosus, so it's a cone-shaped region that leads to the pulmonary trunk. Right at the point or the tip of the conus arteriosus is the pulmonary valve, and the muscular wall is made up of muscles like the trabeculae carneae. So carne kind of sounds like carnivore, so it looks meaty. So these muscles kind of look meaty. And then you can actually feel the indentation of the foramen ovale on the right ventricle, but on the left atrium, it has the valve of the foramen ovale. So that's important to note. Now let's move on to the left ventricle. This makes the apex of the heart and of its left surface and border. Contains two cusps of the mitral valve. The thinner trabeculae carneae is more numerous, and it's thinner here. And the aortic valve is where the blood, so it prevents the blood from flowing back to the left ventricle once it enters the aorta. Okay, so that consists of the left ventricle. And then note that in a healthy heart, the left ventricle is 2 to 3 times more thicker than the right ventricle because it's actively pumping that blood. So in hypertension, wall thickness will increase. So now let's talk about the valves. So we have 2 semilunar valves. We have 2 cuspid valves. We also have, so the cuspid valves are found in the heart, and they're good at directing blood in one direction. The semilunar valves are found in great vessels like the aorta and the pulmonary trunk. Now let's look at the tricuspid and mitral valves. So the tricuspid valve is essentially located between the right atrium and the right ventricle. And so the function of this valve is to keep the blood flowing from the right atrium to the right ventricle and prevent the blood from seeping back to the right atrium. It has 3 muscles, hence tri, which control it. So these are the anterior, posterior, and septal cusps. These cusps are all attached by papillary muscles. Okay, so more specifically, the anterior papillary muscle controls the anterior cusp. The posterior papillary muscle controls the posterior cusp, and the septal papillary muscles control the septal cusps. The papillary muscles tighten the tendinous cords, which result in the valves to close, as you can see in this picture. Now, let's talk about the major nerves and vessels of the heart. We have the azygos vein, which empties into the superior vena cava. We also have, on the right side of the body, the brachiocephalic trunk, which gives rise to arteries that supply to the arm and head. So I like to think of the brachiocephalic trunk like Brachiosaurus, because I like to kind of think that the neck here is the trunk, and it supplies to its head. It has a very long neck that goes to its head. And then here I created a flow chart. So the brachiocephalic trunk will divide into the right subclavian artery and the right common carotid artery. The right common artery then further divides into the internal and external carotids. The external carotids supply the neck and the head, and the internal carotids supply the brain. Okay. So a key message is to note that the brachiocephalic trunk is on the right side of the body, but not on the left. Now, when we're talking about the left side of the body, we have the left recurrent laryngeal nerve, the left vagus nerve, and the left phrenic nerve. So again, an mnemonic that I like to use is raccoons visualize predators. And so the left recurrent laryngeal nerve is next to the trachea, travels inferiorly and then superiorly to supply the larynx. The vagus nerve supplies the heart, all of the viscera, thorax, and abdomen. So vagus, so very hardworking. Phrenic supplies the diaphragm, and it's formed from the upper cervical spine, C1 to C3. Now, problems with heart, so heart attacks, right? So using prevention and detection methods, one method to use is stress tests, and these are used to see irregularities in the heart. So patients are either on a treadmill or an exercise bike, as you can see right here, while being connected to an ECG monitor to check their heartbeats. And so irregularities are really seen easily during exercise than at rest as well. Symptoms of a heart attack include tingling of the left side of the arm, abdominal pain, and chest pain and tightness. So you might be thinking, why tingling of the left side of the arm? Well, that's because of the afferent pain fibers. They enter the spinal cord and travel with the sympathetic trunk, which then enters the spinal cord segments T1 to T5 from the left side. And so that's why you get the pain or tingling of the left side of the arm. So you might be thinking, well, why abdominal pain? Well, the brain is kind of confused in this case. Because the visceral pain is accompanied by the sympathetic fibers, which also enter the spinal cord through the posterior roots, and since both the nerve signals for the pain and the heart are actually very close, for the pain to the heart and the abdomen, are very close, and so sometimes from T1 to T5, it can actually move down to T5 to T9, with the brain interpreting heart pain as abdominal pain. And then chest tightness or pain happens because of the coronary artery blockage, which leads to a lack of blood, which stimulates the pain receptors. So coronary blood vessels. So we have 3, right, left coronary arteries, and then the cardiac veins. So hint is right, red light cross. So another mnemonic. So the right coronary artery passes between the right auricle and the pulmonary trunk. So we have major branches, which include the right marginal branch, the right border of the heart, conducting system branches, posterior interventricular branch, AV nodal branch at the crux. Okay, so a hint that I like to use is receptionist crust pore aurora. So another mnemonic. For the left, and then going back to this, the RCA, so the right coronary artery, supplies the right atrium, the right ventricle, posterior third of the interventricular septum, the sinoatrial node for 60% of the people, atrioventricular node for 80% of the people, and it's part of the diaphragmatic surface as well, which is part of the left ventricle. The left coronary artery consists of the circumflex branch, which turns around and bends around the heart posteriorly. The left marginal branch and the posterior interventricular branch arise from the circumflex branch. The circumflex branch also gives rise to the left marginal artery that runs down the left side of the heart. Atrioventricular branch, so anastomosis, are branches that connect the anterior interventricular branch to the posterior interventricular branch. The anterior interventricular branch gives rise to the lateral/diagonal branch. This supplies the left atrium, left ventricle, as well as some of the right ventricle as well. So, talking about cardiac veins, we have the coronary sinus, which is one of the largest veins and thickest. And so I like to kind of think about sinus migraines to help me remember, because when you do get a sinus migraine, those are very, very horrible. So a large, huge migraine. And this coronary sinus actually drains all of the other veins into the right atrium of the heart, except the anterior cardiac veins. So the anterior cardiac veins drain directly into the right atrium, so here other veins would go from the veins to the coronary sinus and then to the right atrium. The small cardiac vein is also found on the right side of the heart. The small cardiac veins drain from the anterior portion of the heart from the right side. In contrast, the great cardiac vein drains from the left side of the body. The middle cardiac vein moves medially, and then we have the left marginal vein and then the left posterior interventricular vein. And so again, an anomic that I like to use is Sally gave me lemon lollipops. So here's a great picture that shows the types of veins, and as you can see, the coronary sinus being the thickest one right here. So conducting system of the heart. So we start off with the sinoatrial node, which is the heart's pacemaker that produces rhythm. This rhythm is then carried and travels by myogenic conduction through the right atrium, and then the atrioventricular node, and then the atrioventricular bundle of His, and then the Purkinje fibers, which stimulate the ventricle walls and the papillary muscle. So end goal is to essentially stimulate that papillary muscle. Now here's the cardiac plexus, and I'm going to go through, so I developed this flow chart, and I'm going to go through the steps. So the T1 to T6 lateral horns lead to the sympathetic nervous system fibers. The signal then travels to the SNS, so sympathetic nervous system presynaptic fibers, the cervical and thoracic sympathetic trunk, the sinoatrial and atrioventricular nodes, and then the parasympathetic fibers in the coronary arteries. So the effects here I'm going to show in a Venn diagram to compare and contrast. So with PNS effects, we have a decrease in heart rate because the heart doesn't have to pump as hard, and so that reduces the force of contraction and then vasoconstriction of the coronary arteries as well. Both are controlled by the nervous system as well, so these effects are controlled by the nervous system. And the SNS effects include increasing the heart rate, so vasodilation of the coronary arteries to increase that blood supply and oxygen to the muscles, and that increases the force in contraction as well. So your heart starts pumping much quicker. Now lastly, lymphatic drainage. So the subepicardial lymphatic plexus drains the myocardial and subendocardial tissue. The inferior tracheobronchial lymph nodes drain into the bronchomediastinal trunks, which then drain into the right lymphatic and thoracic duct as well. So this is a picture that outlines the various pathways of drainage as well. So thank you so much for watching. This sums up our second unit for the respiratory, circulatory, and the coronary blood vessels. So I hope you learned something new, and I'll see you next time.